Eumeswil by Ernst Jünger, 1977. Produced by Parker Banks at pbanks.net and youtube.com/pbanks. Nightbar notes. 23. If my dear brother had any inkling of what I toss away en passant, he would be through with me for good. I would have laid hands on his most hallowed treasure, freedom of the press and capital punishment. I usually give these phrases a wide berth at the family table, for were I to voice even the slightest criticism, the game could be up for me altogether. He would never get it into his head that freedom begins where freedom of the press ends. Freedom of thought. This means that he would never test his stale ideas in a state of primeval freedom. I am willing to grant that he is rooted in liberal traditions, although they are more diluted and mitigated in him than in my genitor. Even good ideas have their time. Liberalism is to freedom as anarchism is to anarchy. Cadmo, to enlighten me, often takes me along to his storm companions. I am not really welcome there. Perhaps they even regard me as an agent of the domo, who, by the by, knows about their meetings but considers them irrelevant, indeed almost useful. A barking dog never bites. The main reason I have a hard time getting along with these men is their indecisiveness. They feel when they ought to think, and vice versa. All they have inherited from Socrates is skepticism, but unlike Xenophon, they would not hoist him on their shoulders and carry him out of the fighting. Convinced as they are of the temporal and finite nature of things, they shy away from pain, sacrifice, devotion. My dear brother, even after much soul-searching, has not become an anarchist like, say, Zerwick, who edits the Wren. Zerwick's ideas flow glibly from his lips and his pen. He converts them into the ferment of decay. I am using this image, a favorite of the conservatives, because I enjoy it. For the anarch, however, decay is a process like any other, and for the historian, this Zerwick is more informative than my genitor and my dear brother. One could regard him as an antechamber counsellor, or even a doorman who steps away after performing his task, for that is what it is. There is also something of the lackey about him. He belongs to the ruler's entourage, and he vanishes with him. He hides in the condor's plumage, living for the moment when he can soar beyond him. If ever I should write an essay on this type, I will start with Beaumarchais, who, after engaging the nobles whose sole effort is being born, eventually was himself defamed for being a courtier. Defamation to the point of character assassination is the usual livelihood here. Such ponderings repeatedly make me aware of the limits to the writing of history, or rather, to its contemplation. The suffering begins the instant we take pen in hand. I agree with my teacher Vigo that we succeed only in achieving more or less sharp-edged perspectives lanes through the grown forest. Above all, we have to disregard the will, disregard partisanship. The true historian is more of an artist, especially a tragedian, than a man of science. When I, as I am doing here, examine the powerful man's relationship to his opponent, I stumble upon the antithesis between the person who lays claim to freedom of action and the person who lays claim to freedom of thought. These are figures that recur not only in history but in myth as well, all the way into the animal kingdom. Fable lives on them. The lion is powerful, Reynard the fox is cunning. Fine, the antithesis lies deeper, within matter itself. The ruler embodies stasis. He is painted like Zeus, sitting or standing. His adversary is nimble. There is hardly a more agitated sculpture than the bronze statue that the Athenians put up for the tyrannicides, Harmodius and Aristogiton, both paid with their lives for the assassination. That is the classical ending when blood flows. I played a series of examples at the Luminar, from the assassination of Julius Caesar to the one in Sarajevo. These two murders were similar insofar as each provided the oriflamme for a world war. If we delve all the way into the atoms, differences vanish, like the ones between Caesar and that insignificant Austrian prince. Both men, like their assassins, were subject to the same constraint. In this, too, I go along with Vigo's idea that the historian has to supply images, not explanations. Nonetheless, the atomic reality has to shine through in color and drawing, in deeds and characters. Naturally, our Zervik cannot be placed on the same level as Harmodius, nor is that an issue for me. Aside from the fact that as an Anak I strive to remain free of value judgments, Eumeswil suffices for my studies precisely because I am impartial. The night bar is my aquarium. The fish have fins and teeth like those in the ocean. Bruno peers into a crystal ball where he sees the kings campaigning with their armies. Zervik, as I have said, bodies forth the disquiet with which a moving object circles a static one, trying to drive it from the center. That is a law of nature. If the condor were to fall, the tribunes would soon have an equivalent satellite in Zervik. This is based simply on the fact that every regime, even the best, finds its opposition, and with it a public that, if not hailing the assault, at least enjoys it as a balancing stunt. Indeed, Zervik has something of the tightrope walker in him. Then again, he also resembles a balladeer, the kind who performs in a cabaret as a master of double entendres, who, when one tries to grab him, slips away. At times, he is also as daring as the picador who riles the bull, making its blood boil, and who could easily be tossed on its horns at any moment. Recently, when I was at the Luminar, participating in a parade on Berlin's Tempelhof field, a certain incident reminded me of Zervik's trapeze acts. The King of Prussia was taking his good time. A cobbler's lad who was sitting in a tree called out, "Ain't the creep coming yet?" A policeman yanked him down. "You goddamn brat, who did you mean?" "My brother, of course, who else?" At last, the king came and reviewed the troops. Afterward, the cobbler's lad went over to the officer of the peace. "Officer, who did you mean?" This roughly corresponds to the winks in Zervik's essays. Many people are surprised that the condor puts up with him. His tolerance, too, runs a gamut, for depending on the weather, this scribbler can develop from a court jester to a thoroughgoing nuisance and finally to a dangerous man. At present, he is in the middle range, so he could still be gotten rid of without any scandal. After a change, at which point I would retreat to the acacia grove, he might be the great man in Eumeswil for a few weeks. Even his opponents have to admit that he is eminently gifted as a journalist. The Domo himself reads every issue of the Wren hot off the press, and presumably not only as police chief, but with gusto. He does, moreover, have a sense of clean prose and logical precision. During dinner I stand by in the bar. I check the air, the temperature, the vaporizer, the glasses in front of me on the counter, the bottles behind me on the shelves. I ask the pantry downstairs whether it is well provided. Most of the dishes come up ready to be served. I order them by means of key words. The dinner, as a rule, is simple. It lasts for 3/4 of an hour. A trio plays at the start, after the appetizer, and during dessert. The dining room is known as the mess hall or refectory. Once the condor rises from the table, several of the convives, always including Attila and the Domo, accompany him to the yellow salon, where mocha and liqueurs are served. Smoking a cigar is permitted, though the condor finds it disagreeable. Depending on his whim and mood, by no means always, the condor may feel like going next door to the night bar. Anyone who wishes to, a la Sire Marley, may join him. The Domo notifies me. The minions take their seats. Before dinner, the Domo has delivered his report to the condor. After that, there is to be no shop talk, although dribs and drabs inevitably filter in. I find them more instructive than if I had been present during the report tidbits for my insatiable appetite. Let me repeat that I prefer the history of cultures to the history of states. That is where humanity begins and ends. Accordingly, I value the history of royal courts and even back courts over that of politics and parties. History is made by people and at most regulated by laws. That is why it is so inexhaustible with surprises. I do not wish to digress too much from Zervik. Granted, his name never crops up at the night bar. He is deliberately ignored. Yet it is obvious when some dust has been kicked up by one of those articles that my dear brother reads gloatingly. Just recently, for instance, when the diners emerged from the yellow salon, the Domo said, "I've checked the Meidinger." The Meidinger is our encyclopedia, a truly Alexandrian opus. The Domo favors a precision that almost transcends the limits of necessity. He wants to grasp not only the strict meaning of a word, but also its subliminal sense. To do so, one must delve into both its etymology, like Thofen, and the magic of its sounds, like Bruno. In the Domo, such probing is astonishing in that he offers no hint of aesthetic inclinations. Rather, I would suspect a need for legalistic exactitude. If the word is to hit home, it must home in. I have already mentioned the waterfront case, a life and death matter that hinged on the judges allowing a distinction between stab and slay. The Domo's great musicality may be consistent with a decidedly rational character. We have surgeons, architects, even fairly disreputable policemen with aesthetic interests. Perhaps their houses have only this one spiral staircase leading down to the foundations. Whenever my husband picked up his violin, he became a better person. This was a woman testifying in a sordid trial, and I liked what she said, although as an Anak I would have expressed myself differently. Be that as it may, one cannot fully fathom the ground of a character, and precisely this failure has its grounds. The Domo's meticulous use of language contrasts strangely with the way it is routinely mangled in Eumeswil. Hackneyed phrases are all that we hear, as well worn as pennies tossed to beggars, and indeed they come more from academics than from the harbour or the market. This has not always been so. The farmer, the artisan, the hunter, the soldier, the crook knew how to animate powerful images. The Feller period has made a clean sweep of such talents. Humanists of Sperling's and Kessmuller's cast have done their bit. The goal was annihilation of correct language. Le style, c'est l'homme. This notion was revoked. Intellectual rank was no longer to be identified by a mastery of language. The result is a banal chit-chat defective in both its heights and its depths. To be sure, there were errors in calculation. Even in times when there are no cabinet makers left, one still distinguishes the well-built armoire or even a planed board from all the others. Similarly, when elites have grown rare or shrunk down to a few individuals, the clear, unadulterated word convinces the uneducated man, indeed precisely him, the non-miseducated man. He senses, and this puts his mind at ease, that the ruler still observes rules despite his power, Caesar non supra grammaticos, a solace in periods of decline. 24. Far be it from me to liken the Domo to Caesar, but as I have already said, the study of fish in our lagoon is useful for looking back in history. What had he checked in the Maidinger? I was to find out immediately, for after the minions had adjusted the chairs of their masters and they sat down, he continued, "So far as I can tell, the vulture has been honored in both the Roman and the German nations, at least in times that were not so sterile as ours." He launched into etymological niceties. Vulture comes from Latin vulture, which is probably cognate with velere, to pull, pluck, and also with vulnerable. The German word for vulture is Gier, which is related to gier, greed, avidity, in its earlier form, Giebe. The adjective gierig, greedy, avid, refers to someone who will not give up his prey. Carrion goes back to Latin caro, flesh. The German equivalent ass used to mean simply food and is cognate with the English eat. It meant the bait employed by the hunter. The Roman vulture hints at a swift turn, volta. Valturnus was a raging river in Campania, the Volturno. Language has not only frayed out, it has also moralized itself. So much for the Domo with his collectania. When I heard the word vulture, I knew what was biting him. It was my first day on duty after my vacation. In the morning I had come from the city, purchasing a wren on the way. I do so now and then with half-disgusted curiosity in order to keep abreast of the overall mood. But I get my copy at the newsstand. I believe I've already noted that the number of actual subscribers to the magazine is tiny, although nearly everyone reads it. The subscription list is, of course, available at the Kasbah. Being on it would not be incriminating, but together with 2 or 3 other names, it could draw the circle tighter around you. In my ease, for instance, my family would be linked to me. That was precisely why Zerwick began mailing me free copies several years ago, which was almost worse. I therefore politely asked him not to send me any further issues. It is my old complaint. getting caught between parties whose quarrels I find cumbersome and often repugnant. At times I have one party on my back, at times the other, and occasionally both at once. The current issue included a pseudonymous article that bore Zerwick's unmistakable stamp, The Raptors. Zerwick had costumed himself in a professorial style. First he went into the zoological classification of the diurnal birds of prey and their habits. It boiled down to a comparison of eagles and falcons with vultures. The former were proud creatures that attacked live prey, the latter were scavengers. The vultures of the New World, all listed by name, were described as colossal shredders. The condor was missing, although he, needless to say, was the target. As a true polemicist, Zerwick knew that omission provides the best emphasis. The entre-detraction had to remain camouflaged. Whatever Zerwick thinks or writes, he always means the condor. This will be so even if he survives the condor. He will remain Zerwick's topic for decades. Zerwick would then become a scavenger himself. Pursuer and pursued are always made for each other. The article gave me food for thought, albeit differently than for my dear brother, who no doubt must have been absolutely elated. In depicting the royal eagle and the peregrine falcon, which he cited as epitomes, Zerwick's diction took on a heraldic loftiness. This could have been penned by a Chateaubriand, who, to be sure, was already an equivocal figure. If Zerwick can pick at the condor, he will stop at nothing. As a nihilistic conjurer, he pulls whatever he likes from his top hat, liberty caps or crowns and scepters. I mention this because it fits in with a New Year's mood that is spreading through the tyranny. Each man nurtures his own ideal, which barely makes it past the surging of jubilation. I once thought of 100-year calendar with the Journée des Dupes as one of the recurrent red-letter days. The anarch nurtures no expectations. He stakes on no one but himself. Basically, people remain Pied Pipers, whatever melodies they play to introduce themselves. And as for the rats, that is a chapter unto itself. The snare was cunningly set, even with regard to its timing. In dictatorships, there are two phases that demand particular caution. One phase comes right after the seizing of power. New brooms sweep clean. The second announces the end. The ruler tries once again to forge ahead, but he lacks a consensus. This makes him even more dangerous. A man must now be on his guard if he is not to get caught in the last-minute throng. In between, there are lulls, during which one can indulge in all sorts of things, like this foray into zoology. In eras filled with rich images, fables served that purpose, just as scholarship does here. Yet Zerwick did not lack the epigrammatic pointedness that Lessing calls for. Still, his portrayal of the vulture's meal went beyond the boundaries. His quill had been guided by pure hatred. Anyone conversant with the internal affairs of Eumeswil found material galore to interpret. Every polemical analysis of a seizure of power distinguishes between those who blaze the trail and those who come along for the ride. The trailblazers that Zerwick cited were a species of raven or carrion crow, small, nimble, hungry blackcoats. They scent the weakness of a large animal before it even drops. Perched on the branches of bare trees, they watch its agony. Since their tiny beaks are incapable of tearing it up, they must wait for the vulture to perform this task. Meanwhile, they busy themselves with the eyes and the anus. It is the agitation they spread through the atmosphere that first alerts the king vulture. He then swoops down and does the carving. Next come the fellow travelers, big and small, each according to rank. Order is restored. With an obvious sense for the nasty, Zerwick lovingly dwelt on the details of this gruesome repast. Especially graphic was his description of a turkey vulture, which, sporting a hooked beak and a wrinkly, bluish-red throat, pokes its head into the body openings and dabbles in the tripe. A striking portrait of the Minister of Finance, whom I often observe up close at the night bar. Zerwick knows his craft, of that there can be no doubt. When reading such excursuses, I, as a historian, keep my distance, not only from their tabloid polemics, but also from their timeless verities. Zerwick has grasped the mechanics of coup d'etat for the succession of dictatorships, which have long been the only kind of regime to maintain relative order here. Even the tribunes need their general. Zerwick sees this as a journalist, not a historian. It therefore escapes him that he is describing the methods of not only the condor, but also his predecessors and successors. Furthermore, Zerwick is painting a self-portrait, for he is one of the carrion crows. If, rather than an anarchist, he were an anarch without moralisms or prejudices, he could make a name for himself as a historian. But, like all men of his ilk, he prefers to take the cash and let the credit go. The historian's sorrow and his transformation into an anarch derive from his insight that the cadaver cannot be cleared away, and that more and more swarms of flies and vultures regale themselves on its flesh. Thus, all in all, they are based on the world's imperfection and on the suspicion that something is inherently wrong. Seen politically, systems follow one another, each consuming the previous one. They live on ever-bequeathed and ever-disappointed hope, which never entirely fades. Its spark is all that survives as it eats its way along the blasting fuse. For this spark, history is merely an occasion, never a goal. One more item about the cadaver. Zerwick's interviews are feared. He knows how to ask trick questions. Say, "How do you feel about the fact that your opponents call you the gravedigger of the tribunate?" To which the interviewee, a high-ranking magistrate, replied, "Before the gravedigger comes, you have to have a corpse." Zerwick also serves as a showpiece for the Domo, demonstrating his liberalism. Still and all, the excursus on the vultures was a bit much. The guys trying to make fools of us. The mood was blatantly sour. When they had taken their seats, Attila, to the condor's left as usual, said, "We do have an expert, Rosner. He could help us out." The condor, "Right, let's send for him. I'm curious to know what kind of bird I am." The Domo passed the order on to me. "Manuelo, telephone him. After all, you watch birds for him." True enough. I also knew that the professor could still be reached in his institute at this time of night. Incidentally, the Domo's remark once again showed me how well investigated I am. Half an hour later, Rosner was in the Kasbah. The guard announced him. Upon entering, the bespectacled professor looked like a startled nightbird himself, but he regained his composure upon hearing what it was all about. The condor motioned toward a seat and assigned him a minion who snuggled against him. I wondered how Rosner would manage to wriggle out of it, the expert as a dubious figure. The Domo turned to him. "Professor, we have summoned you because of that concoction about eagles and vultures in the wren. I assume you are familiar with it?" "Sorry, Your Excellency, but I never read pulp. Besides, my work leaves me no time for such things. Still, I would gladly help with factual information." Not a bad start. He was sure to do well. After being filled in, he got down to the gist. First of all, what is a scavenger? We must avoid judging such matters anthropocentrically, in terms, that is, of human taste. After all, we too never consume animal protein in statu vivendi, with the exception of oysters. If that were to constitute a criterion, then bloodsuckers like mosquitoes and vampire bats must dine more nobly, as must the woodpecker, which hacks maggots out of the heartwood. Fresh meat strikes us as less palatable, so we let it age, often till it becomes quite gamey. Nor should we forget dairy products like cheese, whose advanced putrescence is revealed by its very smell, and yet it titillates our taste bulbs. Incidentally, the biologist places no value judgment on the process of decay. The bios passes through a series of stations in the vast digestive tract of nature. Rosner's statements, I felt, were not bad. They dovetailed with my views on the changes of polities. The endless succession of dynasties and dictatorships is not explained by their imperfection alone. A peristaltic movement must play a role. It does not lead upwards. Rather, the sum total of suffering remains constant. Indeed, a knowledge hidden in matter seems to be corroborated. This is already indicated by the naive fervor with which all revolutionaries utter the word movement. It is their fateful word with which they rise and fall. Rosner is a materialist of the purest water, and as such too intelligent to be a Darwinist. One could describe him as a successor to certain neo-vitalists. A touch of anonymous piety, such as distinguishes the classical naturalists, is nicely fermented and sublimated in him. Aside from needing him for my private war, I have often enjoyed conversing with him, both about issues pertaining to his field and about other things as well. Ornithology has a special magic, a depth of perception that links homeland with immensity. Moreover, it focuses on the wealth and splendor of life. The eye rests on the richness of the palate. It is satisfied not in hope, but in the here and now. No progress, universalia in re. Incidentally, the Anak can usually converse nicely with the unrelenting materialist. Many years ago, Hippel's wine garden in Berlin was a fertile soil for such conversations, a crucible in which, to be sure, only amalgams succeeded. It was a gathering place for the free men, who styled themselves an isolated volunteer corps of radicalism. I have summoned them to the Luminar, and I will go into detail later on. Initially, I saw them as a typical Germanic coven, huddling at the trunk of the cosmic ash tree and dreeing their weird. Whenever we track down the great turning points, we wind up in one of their universities, Tübingen, Königsberg, Göttingen. But who is familiar with those names today? What Rosner had said about viewing putrescence non-judgmentally seemed to have stimulated Attila too. The unicorn was stroking its beard. A spark remains, although in disreputable circumstances. I can confirm this as a physician. We ought to return the spark to the gods. He looked at the condor and took his hand. I noted this and stored it in my memory, like anything else said in the bar. It was not until the great hunt was approaching that this remark struck me as more meaningful than a casual maxim. Rosner said, "That is not within my area of expertise." The conversation now took a different turn, insofar as non-judgmental observation of putrescence had also given the condor food for thought. I will note that for the next exhibition. I prefer a dung heap by Hauser to a Madonna by Cario. Would it not at least be possible to have a jury free of value judgments? To which the domo, at whom the question was directed, replied, "That is impossible, if only because it contradicts logic. The jurors are supposed to judge. It is best to let them do as they like, provided they do not interfere with politics. Yet it is impossible to uproot this propensity." The domo's aesthetic taste is confined to music. His opinions on style and language are grounded in the classics. I would not claim that he has no understanding of the fine arts, but he will always side with the draftsmen and not the colorists. His private domicile is appointed in classical style, a spare, sober elegance. It is neither too warm nor too cold, and one speaks softly there rather than loudly. The walls boast a single painting, a Vermeer rescued from the great fires, with contrasting planes of lemon and ultramarine. Only the bull's-eye window panes are iridescent, as if the master wanted to provide an example of his command of the intermediary tones. The domo has a standing desk there, from which he dictates should he summon a scribe after dinner. He may do so late at night, even though reading is more of a diversion for him. I once had to classify his bedside library, plays and histories, no novels or poems, instead a collection of maxims from Heraclitus to Montaigne and Lichtenberg. His own maxim, incidentally, is, "First the chessboard, then the game." In his office he sits at his desk and receives people with a terse ceremony geared to the specific visitor. The huge window faces the city. A televisor can bring in all parts of the city, even the hidden ones. A second apparatus receives news uninterruptedly. A small bell jingles only when the moderator believes that the news deserves special attention. Just as he does not appreciate paintings in which the color dissolves or even annihilates the forms, so too does he hate an emotional emphasis of political facts. Feelings are a private matter. He finds enthusiasm suspect, even if it is for the condor. Human beings are ungrateful, especially when they are spoiled, so we reckon with this from the very start. When the condor had shelled the city, the domo occupied the town hall, where he was told by several of the deputies who had not fled, "We will yield only to force." "That is sensible, and here it is," and he pointed to the sailors standing behind him in the door. That should suffice to indicate that the domo could not be comfortable with the drift of the conversation. Rosner now wanted to go into the relativity of smells. For many animals, if not most, scents become attractive only when the putrescence is fairly advanced. On the other hand, dogs can fall ill from smelling perfume. Often this is a question of dosage. Thus, The delicious fragrance of attar of roses conceals a hint of scatol, the substance that gives excrement its fecal odor. I followed every word of Rosner's lecture while mixing him his orange juice with a shot of gin, noting the consumption and taking care of other obligations required by my job. This affords me, as I have said, a certain pleasure, and I would be a good barkeeper even if I had to do it full-time for want of something better. In this activity, as in others, driving, selling, teaching, informing, operating, it is crucial to take it very seriously for a while and do it thoroughly until it is mastered. It is then performed either automatically or playfully. One has thus gotten past the period of thinking. For example, I know a croupier on Place Hassan who slides the chips so elegantly across the table that the bettors scarcely notice whether they have won or lost. In fact, most types who deal a lot with money have a fluid vein. This is shown by the way they flip through banknotes or strew coins across the counter. Here in Eumeswil, where payments are made with gold, this is a poem. Such people are recognized simply by the way they don a hat or walk through a door. Magic is involved, or at least a touch of legerdemain. This makes for self-assurance, as expressed in the litheness of my motions behind the bar. The guests like it. They would be less edified if they knew what else I was thinking about. These are, en passant, 3 dialectical stages. First, the personal and material task, then its transcendence through exercises, and finally the liberation leading to universal, which for me are historical perceptions. In this respect, Rosner's explanations are an example of how to be at ease in society. Since he could not possibly exclude the vulture from the scavengers, he tried at least to ennoble its food or present it as fairly common. Furthermore, Rosner could also point to categorical distinctions, say, the fact that there are puny eagles and mighty vultures. The domo seemed to expect as much. He said, "Professor, do not draw out the preamble. We would like to hear all about the condor." 25. Rosner was able to report marvelous things. He sketched an impressive picture of this bird, which has a greater wingspan than any other feathered creature. The condor soars without beating his wings over the loftiest peaks of the Cordilleras, over the icy tops of smoking volcanoes. Though invisible to the sharpest eyes, the condor notices anything happening in the narrow gulches, the quebradas, or the atmosphere. If the lower vultures start circling, which means they have spotted prey, then he swoops into the depth, and no creature dares contest the meal, much less approach him before he is sated. The tyrant, having listened more and more benevolently, now wanted to know whether this bird was completely dependent on carrion. By no means, if one cared to believe the professor, the powerful take what they like. Shepherds on the Serrata claim, and scientists have followed suit, that the condor, by baring his wings, terrifies the animals in the high mountains, the alpacas and guanacos, until they hurtle from the precipices. Then he plunges to the bottom of the abyss and feasts on them. One recognizes the Grand Seigneur chiefly by his banquets. The beach is his table, on which the ocean leaves huge morsels, seals, sea lions and dolphins, even a whale, which, if stranded, is crushed to death by its own weight. The professor went further into the condor's habitat, calling it his biotope. Most ornithologists are well-traveled. Rosner had obviously done some studies in Cordilleras, for he described such a mountain range, with its rows of volcanoes and gigantic walls, like someone who had hiked through it from the seashore to the high plateaus. He knew it from the jungles on its flanks to the edge where glaciers push into the ocean. Rosner also reached beyond his science, a colossus that keeps its majesty a secret by covering it with mass. Its impact is immediate, deriving from its sheer weight. However, we must remember that our initial sight of it is upward from sea level, so that we view only half of it. Passion, devotion to the subject, arouses the sympathy of even detached outsiders, as if these matters had found a mediator, a mirror that reflected their light as heat. Of course, not everyone feels it. The courtiers in Berlin dreaded the evenings when Humboldt entertained one of the Prussian Wilhelms with the marvels of the New World. Attila harked back to the image of the stranded whale. The condor cannot possibly take care of it alone. No, but he tears it open. Then huge swarms of gulls, ravens, lower vultures, and even land animals come thronging up. So one could say he lives off Leviathan? Rosner did not care to indulge in such speculations. A poet could phrase it like that. I believe that this is more properly the domain of my colleague Vigo. But Attila dug in his heels. In any case, one cannot deny that the condor has myth-making strength. You must have heard about it from the highlands all the way down to Mexico City. In the course of my evenings, and especially my nights behind the bar, I had concentrated on Attila. Only little by little did it dawn on me that the standards I am used to applying as a historian do not suffice. I have to reach back to archaic things, not only their temporal extension, but also their spatial depth, which is always present. This is virgin soil for me, and I am primed for surprises. As a historian, I am trained to decipher. Here I must guess. That is the difference between a rational and a numinous approach. The hieroglyphs were deciphered roughly around the time when Alexander von Humboldt climbed the peak of Tenerife and the Chimborazo with his instruments, while heraldic figures were being replaced by colors and national borders were solidifying. In the 21st century, when they were wiped out first by economic, then by intellectual principles, the legacy of the Nahuatl tribes was revealed to idle elites. Deciphering was not enough. Such encounters are mutual. They involve an ascent. Likewise, the preceding archaeological disquiet would be inconceivable without Plutonian energy. At the propitious moment, the treasure, as in fairy tales, rises to the surface. That is precisely what strikes me about Attila, a sudden glow from the depths. The old man must have seen a lot, must know a lot that he keeps to himself. My task is to guess what it is. Attila is the counterpart of the Domo, the policy director of the Condor, to whose left he sits as the physician of his body and even more, of his mind. Attila conceals his knowledge because it wishes to be guessed. Just what did he mean with his question about the myth-making strength? The contemporary man provides only fact-making strength. He is quantified as a vote, as a payer and payee, as a species that survives in the registers of government offices and ministries. Any memory of him sinks into the grave with his grandchildren. Anecdote-making strength is greater. It is historic. It concentrates the species with its characteristics. It leaves its stamp for centuries. A mountain chain is recognized in a crystal and a metal in a coin. This is no privilege for rulers and popes. A monk, a peasant, a buffoon can knock more noisily. Myth-making strength, by contrast, is ahistorical, not subject to any derivation or development. It affects history incalculably and unpredictably. It does not belong to time, it creates time. That is why in periods of decline, when the substance of history is exhausted, unable to guarantee even the zoological place of the species, a dull, tacit expectation has adhered to myth-making strength. Theology peters out. It yields to theognosis. People no longer want to know about gods. They want to see them. Needless to say, a historian who despairs of his function becomes sensitive to myth, and all the more alert, because he rejects whatever can be offered by the people around him. He conducts himself, that is, as an anarch. Attila must have spent a long time in the great forests beyond the desert. It would seem as if he wanted to take the Condor in a different direction, while the Domo wishes to keep an iron grip on the status quo, with some latitude but nevertheless within his limits. Both men regard tyranny as the sole framework for keeping the atomized masses in shape and delaying the free-for-all battle. The Domo is a pragmatist, devoid of any transcendental stirrings. The day must teach the day. Better to navigate with a red sail until the ship is wrecked than to drift inactively in the Red Sea. Yet power seeks cosmic fulfillment, otherwise it will die of its own veracity. Power was not enough even for the Caesars. The sea approached one of them in his dreams and whispered its secret to him. Another saw gods appear to him as his equals before the battle. If day is dawning and I am exhausted, I see them hieroglyphically, the condor in the middle as the king vulture, and to his left Attila as a unicorn with a silver beard. Only the Domo still has human features, though modified. That is how Odysseus is depicted on ancient vases. He too is bearded, A fringe of coppery hair curls from his temples down to his chin. It actually sharpens his profile. But I notice that Attila's and the condor's heads suddenly appear as if propped upon their necks, while the domo's head ripples, then rigidifies as if cast. At such times it can happen that I spill wine when pouring it. I then stop taking notes. Attila's question about the myth-making power of animals went far beyond Rosner's scope. The dimensions it aimed at were not those of big game, but those of the cosmic hunt. For what great figures can stars and constellations be named? Since Chaldean times, astrognosy has responded to this question with an unerring instinct. They should be named for gods and animals. Outer space is not for human beings, with few exceptions, such as Palinurus. Nevertheless, the professor was not at a loss. Folklore, manners and mores, as well as totems and heraldry, are within the domain of positive science. Rosner had traveled the Andes from Quito to Cape Horn, learning all sorts of things in villages and towns, and also from the primitives, even though when I was in Tierra del Fuego, he said, I was pursuing a different bird, namely the southernmost hummingbird. In point of fact, the condor was the object of religious worship by the natives. They attributed supernatural powers to it. Unfortunately, its numbers have decreased dramatically. Guano dealers have decimated the population out of greed, and Indians for the plumage. Once in the highlands, I came upon an old man hauling a bagged condor on his shoulders. He praised it as a morsel fit for a king, and distinguished 3 sorts of condor flesh, one tasting like beef, one like horse, the best like condor. He also said that the bird's stomach and heart provided a miracle drug. Rosner then detailed the tricks for catching the great tyrant. A hunter lies under the skin of a freshly slaughtered bull, with the bloody side up. Once the condor perches on it, the Indian, using the hide like a sack, wraps up the bird's claws and ties them with a string. Then the other men come dashing over. In many districts they stuff llama cadavers with narcotic herbs. The vultures, intoxicated by their meal, hop around in a circle. They are subdued with bolas, or else a poncho is thrown over them. On the plateau of Huascaran, the Indians place dead mules on the rim of a very deep crater. When the condors yank them back and forth, they push the carcass over the edge and plunge after it. From there, they can no longer rise up, and so they fall prey to the hunters. Other things are reported by old travelers, Alexander von Humboldt, Popping, Tschudi, Jerry and Libby McGraham, and also a poet, Pablo Neruda, who has sung the condor's praises. Rosner continued. Once in Peru, I participated in a ritual fiesta that involves the sacrifice of a condor. It always takes place in February. These people are truculent. Though worshipping the bird as a god, they slowly torture it to death. More than anything else, however, the condor is kept for a bullfight. First, they let it starve for a week, then they tie it like a rider to the back of the bull, which has been stabbed bloody with lances. The populace is thrown into a paroxysm while the condor, with outspread wings, rips the mighty animal to pieces. The professor now made his point, which he had obviously prepared with great skill, I must admit, during his lecture. I may assume that this spectacle conceals a totemic encounter. The sacred bird of the Aborigines vanquishes the bull, the symbol of the Spanish conquistadors. In Mexico, incidentally, there are no condors, but only their closest relative, the splendid king vultures, what we zoologists call a vicarious species. The king vulture enjoys the same respect here as the condor in Peru. As we know, the eagle is Mexico's heraldic animal, the eagle holding a serpent in its claws. This refers to the plumed serpent, an Aztec image. During my travels in the interior, and also when I saw Mexicans sitting around a bowl in their harbors, I often had a peculiar thought, although one forgivable for an ornithologist. They could just as easily have the vulture in their coat of arms. It would be appropriate. All that is missing is the king, who, having regaled himself, allots and carves. Perhaps he shows up every so often and comes down to them, recognized as the first among equals, like that Juarez who had the emperor shot. That, too, was a totemic encounter between the king vulture and the Habsburg eagle. He avenged Montezuma. The professor had almost talked himself into a frenzy. I had, of course, been mixing drinks as demanded. The vaporizer was running at medium speed. The room felt cozy. The specialist had spoken. The Wren could not compete. At the same time, the specialist had flown beyond his limits. The ornithologists, perhaps with a not-so-clear conscience, but his institute was richly rewarded. 26. It had grown late. Up in my room after the bar had closed, I lay in bed thinking about the conversations. By and large, the participants do not fully realize what they are saying. That is, the words are weightier than the opinions. Sense is hidden in even the most banal intercourse. When someone enters the room and says, "Good morning," this is a polite cliché, perhaps also a cordial wish. At the same time, it heralds a cosmic event. They had captured the political structure of Eumeswil more sharply than they realized. Perhaps only Attila knew how sharply. He was the farthest from the center. Granted, the condor lived off Leviathan, but this Leviathan was a corpse. No longer a gigantic toy for the world spirit to have fun with, it was already a cadaver, washed up by the tides. Granted, the king vulture was stronger than the eagle, but this eagle was hardly more than a stuffed, moth-eaten fowl. Rosner had scored a good hit by mentioning Maximilian, one of the last epigoni of Charles V. Juarez had killed one of the rulers of decadence. The condor had swept out the final tribunes. There was still the eagle, a dismal bird, splaying empty claws, stripped of crown and scepter. In his shadow they had their sessions, half Catos and half Brutuses, both unanimous and quarrelling. They succeeded one another in their powerlessness. It all collapsed like a house of cards, and dear old Dad is still mourning the loss. Once authority is worn down to the final thread, then the tyrants or despots come. Auctoritas yields to potestas, as Don Capisco explained. Often the intermezzos are more rewarding, especially at the great fracture points. Ingrid was doing her postdoctoral dissertation on one of those topics. We summoned Pompey the Great to the Luminar. His royal features are unmistakable, as were his efforts to restore the monarchy. This trauma haunted the Romans through the centuries. Accordingly, Pompey and not Caesar was the ideal figure for Brutus to protest against. Caesar, stabbed by Brutus, fell at the foot of the statue of Pompey. Such images normally succeed only in dreams. I will resist the temptation to lose myself in them. Let me therefore only briefly mention one of the models of the intermediary period that we reviewed in Vigo's garden. Bruno was also present. Our theme was a comparison between a Russian revolutionary named Trotsky and Peter the Great. Both were confronted with the problem of coordinating a spatially limited revolution with the current state of the world, especially Europe. The Tsar's solution worked, Trotsky's failed. Perhaps he had staked too much on the cliché of 1789, thereby, like Brutus, misjudging the situation. Nevertheless, the Fourth International contained the stronger thrust toward a world revolution. I do not wish to expatiate. The discussion was shaken to its core when Bruno gave technological development the priority over economic development. Trotsky accused Stalin of thermidorism. He himself, with Lenin, called for socialism plus electricity, but, according to Bruno, got stalled at mid-course. The materialists of the 18th Christian century were more consistent in their thinking than those of the 20th. Still and all, the First World State would have been inconceivable without the leveling impact of technology, especially electronics. One might also say, again according to Bruno, it was their byproduct. Vigo, who innately despises technology, heartily agreed. If the condor is overthrown by the tribunes, little will change, for they too would need to practice violence. Only the style will differ. The tyrant is replaced by demagogues. The demagogue remains at the helm by orienting the plebiscite according to his wishes. The art lies in the posing of questions. If they are put successfully, then the response is overwhelming, not only in its massiveness, but also in its intellectual uniformity, which goes all the way to the top. The condor tries to avoid plebiscites. They would be a foreign language to him. On the other hand, he makes use of popular demonstrations. If an opposition becomes too blatant, then the domo is always capable of raising and subduing violent storms along the waterfront or in the marketplaces. For the curtain raiser, a semi-tolerated underground press in the style of l'Ami du Peuple wants heads to roll. This usually suffices. Otherwise, the popular anger seethes and becomes virulent. During such eruptions, one glimpses neither the military nor the police, not even well-known partisans. Quite the contrary, the domo does not deploy them until the mob does more than smash the windows. The mighty condor then takes his adversaries under his wing. Power is not entirely absorbed in politics. Personal elements unavoidably seep in. This is the limit at which both tyrants and demagogues stoop to despotism. Mania forces its way in, outstripping power and often verging on the comical. Despite his weak voice, Nero wanted to rank first even as a singer. Recently I watched his grotesque performance at the circus in Naples, where 5,000 hippies were distributed in gangs across the tiers in order to applaud. The cheers began with the humming of bees and intensified into a hollow brick sound until it surged as a kettle resonance into the arena. Another Commodus, who claimed to be a descendant of Hercules, personally killed wild beasts in the Colosseum and guzzled from a cudgel-shaped glass. Incidentally, I find this Commodus strange, the embodiment of the Anak monk. I am not alluding to details reported by Lampridius, say that he gathered noblewomen in the palace, ordered them to strip naked, and then examined them like a buyer at a brothel. What was unusual was that he had this and others of his obscene exploits recorded in the government protocols. The Anarch's study of the history of the Caesars has more of a theoretical significance for him. It offers a sampling of how far rulers can go. In practice, self-discipline is the only kind of rule that suits the Anarch. He, too, can kill anyone. This is deeply immured in the crypt of his consciousness, and above all, extinguish himself if he finds himself inadequate. The tyrant, even when degenerating into a despot, supplies a richer selection of anecdotes than the demagogue. Sulla and Marius are cases in point. A large-scale demagogue who turned up when the planet Pluto was discovered dabbled in painting just as Nero did in singing. He persecuted painters whose works he did not like. He dabbled in other areas too, for instance, as a strategist who doomed many people but was technically perfect, as a chauffeur in all directions who eventually had himself cremated with the help of gasoline. His outlines melt into insignificance. The torrent of numbers wipes them out. The pickings are slim for both the historian and the anarch. Red monotony, even in the atrocities. Unlike that demagogue, the condor stays within the modest borders of Eumeswil. Progress is completed. Domestic unrest drives events in a circle, like the hands of a clock. There is no progress, I often hear my janitor say. He seems to regard this as a misfortune. He also says standing still means going backward. The little people, in contrast, are satisfied if everyday life remains constant. They prefer to see their chimneys smoking, not their houses. Furthermore, the generals usually work in a less fantastic manner than the demagogues. Almost as children, they are integrated in the hierarchy and accustomed to orders and obedience. They are trained in dictatorship, not dialectics, which can join together in a single person. Trotsky is a good example. The belief that Jews cannot command was a prejudice. Dicto and deco, that is the difference. Experiencing power at an early age, they are familiar with its statics and dynamics. They know how to move others without budging themselves. If a professor, an attorney, or a litterateur comes to power, he finds it intoxicating. He gets lost in inordinate projects. He exaggerates their implementation. The fact that the condor has no ideas is one of the things for which my janitor reproaches him. But when ideas, even good ones, enter such minds, they usually spell misfortune for the world. Mankind has experienced the most absurd things in this area. The egalitarian mania of demagogues is even more dangerous than the brutality of men in gallooned coats. For the anarch, this remains theoretical because he avoids both sides. Anyone who has been oppressed can get back on his feet if the oppression has not cost him his life. A man who has been equalized is physically and morally ruined. Anyone who is different is not equal. That is one of the reasons why the Jews are so often targeted. Equalization goes downward like shaving, hedge trimming, or the pecking order of poultry. At times, the world spirit seems to change into monstrous Procrusts. A man has read Rousseau and starts practicing equality by chopping off heads, or, as Mimi Le Bon called it, making the apricots roll. The guillotinings in Cambrai were an entertainment before dinner. Pygmies shortened the legs of tall Africans in order to cut them down to size. White Negroes flattened the literary languages. The anarch, recognizing no government but not indulging in paradisal dreams as the anarchist does, is, for that very reason, a neutral observer. The historian in him, like an arbiter, sees men and powers marching into the arena. Time gnaws on every regime, and even faster on the good ones. Drawing on this knowledge, the Domo seems to be oriented more to the present than to duration. He has gained yet another day when the guards have marched up after the evening report. Though he often skips dinner, he never misses out on the night bar. I have to telephone him when the Condor shows up there unexpectedly. A short time later, I see him sitting to the tyrant's right. Even late at night, after a long workday, he seems alert and precise, yet not tense. 27. I am still en route to the central bank, but the foregoing was no digression. I have even had to keep it short. These are thoughts that cross the mind during such demarches or even any other activity. They echo the overall theme. That is why I find perfunctory work so easy. I fade it out, while upstairs I've got a home theatre playing for free, and often even simultaneously on different stages. Moving my legs, tending the bar, ripping up a copy of the Wren at the street corner, these actions are marginal. Sometimes I return to the moment in order to enjoy it thoroughly. Arriving at the central bank, I obtain my orders. A few will be sealed, others will follow depending on the situation. Perhaps they will be transmitted to me on the way. I assume that the Domo had his reasons for picking me of all people for this task. An academic, a university teacher, is ordered to go unescorted to a place where huge amounts of gold are stockpiled. Naturally, the bank guards will have reinforcements. I am apparently expected to perform a service that calls for intelligence and presumably tact. The Kasbah, I must here point out, considers the free flow of cash more important than, say, freedom of the press and other postulates which, as the Domo always says, are all well and good but won't buy you anything. He also says, the first thing people here ask is whether the books are balanced. Hence it goes without saying that the central bank is one of the sore spots. In critical situations, the tellers should go about their business as usual. This provides a sense of security. Advance notice is required only for major withdrawals. The treasury can be replenished at any time from the vaults of the Kasbah. They are greater than any possible demand. I must now devote a few words to the finances. Their stability is the main reason why the tyranny has endured for a relatively long time. A precondition is the Domo's lack of imagination. There are obviously two things he has thought about very carefully: police and money. As an anarch, I may find this subject thoroughly uninteresting, but as a historian I had to help him with his studies. Sometimes he would call me late at night. "Manuel, I need a pamphlet by a fellow named Karski. Inflation, commodity prices, and gold production. It must have been published in ancient times before the First World War. Please get me the text tomorrow. His name may possibly be written with AY. Tracking down and getting hold of such things, either up here in the Kasbah or down in the Institute through the Luminar, is child's play." The next evening, upon arriving at the bar, the Domo found the photocopy on the table. Out of dutiful curiosity, I had already taken a peek. In point of fact, the available stock of gold was an important issue. The Domo had started out with the problem of need. He had ordered an investigation into what the average man requires to be content. A certain excess is indispensable when demands are refined, or this is not the same thing spiritualized. The dissatisfaction of the spiritual man is even more dangerous than that of the starveling. A magical bond exists between gold and art. Private excess should benefit aesthetic life and finer handicrafts all the way to bookbinders and cooks, while government excess should benefit the comfort of the masses, especially in the form of games. Distribution of bread is to be avoided. Even superfluous buildings are preferable. Of course, these should be artworks, and that is precisely our problem. A city without wealth is as shabby as a city without poverty. It is delightful to see what life has to offer. Harbours where rouged girls beckon to strangers and peddlers hawk superfluous wares. It is nice to land here. Life must be good. I bought a parrot and let it fly away. The Africans laughed and invited me for a drink. Gold is available beyond demand. That is the chief reason why it must be hoarded. Its invisible might lies in its hoarding. Besides, the prices rise if there is superfluous gold. Inflation hits especially those who live from hand to mouth. The gold mines are located deep in the south. They have rich lodes. These veins have been exploited for a long time, so that the growing shortages during the tribunate seem peculiar by comparison. Despite this wealth, people got to see nothing but paper, smooth banknotes, hot off the press. Even the smallest coin, the copperlet, was adulterated. After that era, it seemed utterly incredible that the condor was paying with gold. This miracle was due to his judging people objectively, indeed skeptically, unlike the tribunes who had stylized the word human into a sublime concept. It is the guiding light for their pedagogical efforts, their promises of happiness, even their messianic prophecies. Needless to say, all this costs money, which, however, they collect from concrete and not ideal human beings. Since they deal in illusions, hard currency soon vanishes. Money, too, becomes fictive. This is a conjurer's trick. Yet, like my dear dad, the tribunes can still be of good faith. It is no coincidence that precisely when things started going downhill with the gods, politics gained its bliss-making character. There would be no reason for objecting to this, since the gods, too, were not exactly fair. But at least people saw temples instead of termite architecture. Bliss is drawing closer. It is no longer in the afterlife. It will come, though not momentarily, sooner or later in the here and now, in time. The Anak thinks more primitively. He refuses to give up any of his happiness. Make thyself happy is his basic law. It is his response to the know thyself at the temple of Apollo in Delphi. These two maxims complement each other. We must know our happiness and our measure. State bankruptcy, despite a huge natural wealth of agriculture and mineral resources, again Mexico supplied an example, has multiple causes such as corruption, overspending, poor planning. Populaces have to pay through the nose for the building mania and bellicosity of rulers and tribunes. Modest, by contrast, are their personal pleasures, although these are resented more deeply. The great ideas blast loudest through the chimney. The condor can pay cash because he has few ideas. Money in hand is persuasive. At worst, he may be accused of squandering on the navy. However, he owed to it his decisive victory in the Civil War. Hunting is done on a lavish scale, not only for his own enjoyment, but as a kind of tribute to the Yellow Khan. And finally, there are the minions. Eumeswil is a nest of fellas. This saves money on armaments, yet requires a supple politics between the great powers. An army in this situation would be a senseless provocation. Our monetary structure is rooted in principles that have stood the test in the greatest times of Heliopolis. Calculation is based on two systems: the buying and selling of either goods or energy. Payment can be demanded in gold for houses, land, machines, tools, all forms of commodities, anything in short that is visible and tangible. This unit of currency is the condor, a coin almost entirely restricted to banks, if only because of its weight. There are 100 scudi to the condor. A scudo constitutes a good daily wage, while one can live extravagantly on a double scudo. For an erotic service in the harbour, the charge is half a scudo. In the 3-star lupanars, a whole scudo. Energy, that is, machine work, compulsory labour of people and animals, the broadcasting of games and news is paid for in soldi. But gold is expected for song and poetry, for writings and artworks, and, as I have said, for erotic services. There are distinctions between salaries and honorariums. Basically, these are simply two forms of accounting, since the amounts can be freely converted. They overlap in the automatic machines, in that the inserted coin can be translated into either values or services. Heliopolis had an even higher category in the form of metals that radiated energy directly. In Eumeswil, this technology has grown obsolete. For one thing, because it proved to be highly dangerous, and also because people have forgotten how to use it. On the other hand, it was perfected in the catacombs. This is to be inferred from modest samples for peaceful purposes, which, like the mechanical pencil or the thermal rings, have been introduced in the city. They recall the mirrors and glass beads for the natives along the slave and gold coasts. Thus, we have the soldo for energy services, the scudo for goods. Now, why the distinction, since either can be converted at any time and at any counter? Our currency expert is Professor Scavo, whom the Domo occasionally brings to the night bar. His marginalia yield an item or two for my notes. Most of his remarks deal, of course, with practical concerns, say, the gold drain, which has always been a problem for mercantile societies, but still he inevitably has to touch on fundamental issues. Once again, I am astonished by the Domo's restraint, his sang-froid in restricting himself to rational and measurable dimensions. What counts for him is the weight of gold, not its magical prestige, which fascinates men like Bruno. In one of our nocturnal conversations, Bruno said that there were 3 revealed secrets: the serpent, the Jews, and gold. In each of them, salvation and disaster still cleave together, which spells doom for reason. An expert like Scavo does not venture behind the scenes, something that delights the historian. Facts, not ideas, are his staples. Obviously, Scavo feels that the existence of 2 currencies is important in practice as well. There has to be a money that is rapidly used up. The soldo permits this circulation as it is cyclical. The scudo, in contrast, is vertical. This force of gravity explains its efforts to vanish into the ground until grass grows over it. That was not bad. It was complemented by a different kind of drain, namely hoarding. Gold is socked away. The condor hoards the biggest piggy bank under the Casbah. This creates a counterweight. Gold must be shown on the money changer's table. Nothing succeeds like success. By their functions, the soldo could be likened to a checking account, the scudo to a savings account. In daily practice, as I have said, the distinction vanishes, not to mention that payments have reached a high degree of abstraction. Anyone in possession of a phonophore, in other words, nearly everyone, is always solvent. His account is kept up to date automatically. The arrangement is complicated, but the procedure simple. Through the phonophore, I pay more quickly and more easily than with a check. The leveling of society through automation, the way in which cardinal issues of wages and labor are revolutionized, that is a story unto itself. Here in Eumeswil, it seems as if the system occasionally falls asleep and the city begins to dream. The ship founders on a sandbank and then gets back afloat. Electric power stops. After a while, the machines start up again. During such recesses, the Anak measures his own strength and autonomy. After observing Scavo at the night bar once or twice, I attended his course when I happened to be at the university. I saw that my notion about current was not accidental. Electricity has exerted a much stronger impact on property and thereby on money than steam has. Scavo said, "The equivalent value of the soldo is energy. The scudo's value is intrinsic. It therefore has purchasing power for both objects and energy. The relationship remains hidden, since either soldi or scudi can be taken in payment. The soldo is, however, if not fictive, then effective tied, that is, to the performance of services. This is made obvious by disturbances inside the world of labor. In the worst-case scenario, a blackout, the soldo becomes worthless, while gold retains and even increases its value." This is roughly the skeleton, which he filled out with historical flashbacks. Inflation resulting from extravagance as after wars, hoarding of potential services through reserves of the unemployed, currency manipulations, rate and price controls, adulteration of coins, the cowrie shell, the Dutch tulip panic, the Abbe Galliani, law and the Spitzeders, the Panama Canal scandal, and so on. A good historical fundament, a lavish yet controlled association. I found inspiration for my field and also for developing his theories at the Luminar. Say, the idea of the historian as a neutral, non-judgmental observer. The Anak, however, is, I am simplifying, on the side of gold. It fascinates him, like everything that eludes society. Gold has its own immeasurable might. It need only show itself, and society with its law and order is in jeopardy. The Anak is on the side of gold. This is not to be construed as lust for gold. He recognizes gold as the central and immobile power. He loves it, not like Cortés, but like Montezuma, not like Pizarro, but like Atahualpa. These are the differences between Plutonian fire and the solar brilliance worshipped in the temples of the sun. The supreme quality of gold is that of light. It bestows through its sheer existence. The movement generated by gold, everything strives toward gold, even when it rests deep in vaults, is merely a reflection of what Agrippa calls its dignity. This is its value. Its price is merely the latter's expression. The value is stable, the price variable and dynamic, and also contingent on fashion. The preeminence of stability comes out in Scavo's theories and even in our daily practice, albeit imperfectly. A conversation that the Domo and Scavo had about these matters is fixed in my memory. They were talking about the actual meaning of work, which the Domo called its genius. He said that whenever genius flows into work, whether a cabinet maker's, a painter's, or a silversmith's, then such work is worth its weight in gold and should be remunerated accordingly. A great deal had already been drunk. Scavo livened up and came out of himself. I helped a bit with the vaporizer. The professor clearly noticed what was bothering the Domo. First, he pointed to the destruction of values by the economic era. It had, he said, been a paraplegia, hindering any superior movement, a paralysis from which no one had recovered. I can only sketch his ideas, and roughly at that. In essence, he went on, only time and piecework were remunerated, quality was replaced by standardization. What you call genius, Excellency, is outside of time. It therefore cannot be rewarded appropriately, much less according to set criteria. Whenever it goes far beyond talent, it is recognized either inadequately or not at all. An artwork fetches high prices long after the death of its creator, who may have died in poverty. Yet the very highest price can signify only that genius is priceless. Hence, even when patrons or rulers spoil a genius, he labors for free. In this respect, he resembles the gods, who bestow freely. The world as creation is not beyond but outside of things. That is where its immutable being is to be found. An advantage of the night bar is that experts reach beyond their grasp here. It has an ambience. That is why I would rather tend bar than serve dinner, although excellent music is offered there. The professor brought his hand to his mouth. He seemed embarrassed by his own brio. But the condor enjoys seeing his guests let go. Thanking the professor, he added a final remark. He tends to express himself simply. Unfortunately, I did not record his exact words. I was too absorbed in the conversation. It touched on distinctions that I ponder both as a historian and as an anarch. The condor has a sense of history and its entanglements. This is attested to merely by his putting the luminar at my disposal. His leaning is one that is especially prevalent in periods of epigony and fellers, I mean the wish for historical equivalences. Tradition, with its works and documents, is then taken as a reproach. The restoral of creation, that is a primal problem. Now the wish may be father to the thought, but not to the artwork, even the humblest poem. In this connection, the condor had been struck by Scavo's maxim that genius exists outside of time and can do nothing but affect it. This implies that genius is also outside of society and independent of it, with which the anarch can only concur. At times, I suspect the condor of hoping to turn Eumeswil into a small-scale Florence. He would then have his Machiavelli in the Domo. When the good spirits have left the house, no invocation can lure them back. Their absence troubled him. Attila had recognized the mistake in this reasoning. If genius were inside time, it would never manifest itself in Eumeswil, but this way we never lose hope. He touched the condor's hand. Nor is a miracle inside time. What could he mean by that? This was not their first debate about genius. They merely had different names for it. From the outlines I jotted down during the nocturnal conversations, I could piece together a mosaic, which of course, like any artistic work, has its cracks and flaws. If Attila were a Christian, then I would have interpreted his statement about miracles accordingly, say, as an echo of old hymns. Such things, like any transcendence, would never occur to him. For Attila, a miracle is possible at any time. It can be experienced. It dwells among us. Transcendence is the sidetrack of reason. The world is more miraculous than as depicted by sciences and religions. Only art has any inkling of it. He seems to regard genius as a finely distributed energy that can appear at any time, in any place. An animal develops other organs. It begins to fly. It changes its species and genus. Or else an individual crops up and gives world history a new direction. Faith did not create the miracle. Rather, the miracle preceded faith. New surprises keep occurring, especially in periods of decline. Attila spent a long time in the great forests beyond the desert. He must have had strange encounters there. When it gets late, an underwater atmosphere pervades the night bar. I grow more alert when observing my aquarium. As in every discussion, the same word may cover different contents. The domo is the most intelligible. For him, genius is an extraordinary achievement, not just in art or science, but also in craft. His reasons for equating it with gold, for honoring it with prizes and awards, are obvious. He knows that a hierarchical society is more easily governed than a leveled one. This is already true in the physical world. The serpent is more dangerous than the millipede. In Eumeswil, where demagogues and fortunate soldiers spell one another, every social distinction has been wiped away. Almost no store is set by medals, yet nobody would refuse 100 pure gold condors, so anyone who wants to hierarchize must relate gold to performance. Furthermore, the domo has tried to enrich his palate by making education less compulsory, indeed, even abolishing it altogether for certain professions. For this, the shepherds and fishermen are grateful to him, as are their children. The other day, when I was sitting in one of Rosner's bird-watching stations on the Sus, 2 shepherd boys were driving their sheep past me. They seemed to be talking about a friend. I heard one of them say, "He has to go to school." He did not exactly sound envious. I was glad that I, as an Anak, renouncing any bond, any limitation of freedom, also reject compulsory education as nonsense. It was one of the greatest wellsprings of misfortune in the world. The condor, too, would like to remunerate works of genius with gold, yet he seeks them in vain. He emulates the Baroque princeling in his capacity as a good paterfamilias. Everyone should be as content as possible in his own way. Politically, the condor cares less than the domo about order and security. Rather, his personal well-being depends on them. This is the point at which egoism becomes amiable. To each his own. No discord should disturb the condor's circle. This is indicated by the mere fact that he, and in this he agrees with the domo, listens to music during his repasts. Thus, unlike colonial masters, he could not maintain an imperturbable conscience when breakfasting on a kilogram of beefsteak and waited on by starvelings. His musicality lends him a grace that is transmitted to his minions. I gaze into my aquarium as into a mirror that brings me remote times, perhaps times that never were. Whatever never happened anywhere, that alone is true. Sometimes a moment of happiness disrupts history like a magic spell. Order subsists with its distinctions, and yet these move in a different way, from the king to the kitchen boy to the convict who shows his chains. They dance instead of walking. They sing as at the opera instead of speaking. They exalt their pleasures in songs. They deepen their suffering in hymns. This, I suspect, is Attila's standpoint. Genius is transmuted into visible harmony. This is its identity, its immediate link with the masterpiece that is the world. Genius dwells not in some afterlife, but in our midst. Anything is possible now and here. A gloss on compulsory education. The anarch learns how to read and write if and when it pleases him. Many children are drawn to a book by innate curiosity. Charlemagne was still illiterate after many years of ruling his tremendous empire. Even when associating with scholars like Alcuin and Peter of Pisa, he had not gotten very far with writing. After all, he had more and better things to do. It is unlikely that Homer knew how to write. The letter inhibits free singing. At any rate, caution is indicated when a boat leaves the sea and glides into the canals. The most dangerous thing of all is numbers. As a historian, I depend on the written word. As an anarch, I can do without it. Incidentally, people in the catacombs have supposedly devised methods for making script superfluous. The luminous pencil is a sample of this development, but that is a different story. Compulsory schooling is essentially a means of curtailing natural strength and exploiting people. The same is true of military conscription, which developed within the same context. The anarch rejects both of them, just like obligatory vaccination and insurance of all kinds. He has reservations when swearing an oath. He is not a deserter, but a conscientious objector. I owe that expression to an old poet whom I summoned to the Luminar, Gustav Sack. The anarch can kill anyone, and this is the basis of his self-confidence, yet he kills only where and when he likes, in any case, far more seldom than the criminal, the chauffeur, or the state. The archaic figure of the mercenary is more consistent with the anarch than is the conscript, who reports for his physical examination and is told to cough when the doctor grabs his scrotum. "Give me gold, and I'll defend your cause, but I can give notice at any time." This may happen out of necessity, out of boredom, or because one likes a man and his cause. In any event, the anarch will reserve his decision when a demand is placed on him, even by his own family. If a weapon is forced on him, he becomes not more reliable, but even more dangerous. The collective can shoot in only one direction, the anarch all around. Gold and soldiers who have sold themselves are made for one another. Humanists like Kessmuller, narrow minds and nitpickers do not know the magic of language. In fact, it makes them uncomfortable. Serpent, a hissing of the passing second. In gold, the unslaked craving. In sold, the slaked craving emphasizes the shiny yellow vowel. When I pay Latifa, whom I will get back to, for lying on the mattress, the fee is in gold. She would find paper as repulsive as the mercenary does. When life strips bare in nakedness, in pillage, and in the ancient sacrifices, people pay with blood and with gold. The man knows that gold is his due. The woman knows even more so that it is her due. And this knowledge will outlive states, no matter how many of them fall or rise. To wrest gold from the individual, to rob him of his claims, these are the strivings of the states, while he seeks to hide his gold from them. They only want what's best for him. That is why they take it away from him. They hoard his gold in deep vaults and pay with paper that loses more value every day. The more domesticated human beings are, the more easily they fall for any swindle. But gold is credible. It contains its own value, hence it never inveigles. The fact that it is shown openly here is one of the merits of Eumeswil.